Hi, I'm Ms. Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, Matthew 1, Part 7. And this week we're going to be talking about betrothal, marriage, and divorce. And this teaching's kind of rated PG. It's not totally G, it's not PG-13, so it should be great for everyone. Before we get started though, I want to really apologize because last week I mentioned a movie that I was looking forward to seeing, and it's never gone badly before, but I'll tell you something. If you were thinking about taking your kids to go see Guardians of the Galaxy 2 based on my excitement level, you do not want to take your children to that movie unless you go see it first. The first one, I wouldn't have had any problem recommending it, but the second one, I was uncomfortable sitting in the movie theater, sitting behind a couple of kids. I was just very, very, very unhappy. Anyway, yeah, I will never ever mention a movie again unless I have actually seen it. Unless I would be willing to see it with children. So anyway, I apologize. Big mistake. Thought it was a safe bet, but I was wrong. So anyway, right now, here we go. Okay, so we're back. I couldn't get my clicky to work. I have no idea why, so I had to start it all over again. Okay, so here we are. Betrothal, marriage, and divorce. And they were very, very different throughout the Bible times. They were different in Genesis than they were after the Torah was given, and especially in the first century. And the first century is way different than it is now. And since the only context you really have, probably, is how we do things now, we're going to do a little compare and contrast. Now, we've talked a little bit about how people were different and they had different ideas about why they would get married and what made a good marriage. And it's about to get really, 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 really different. All right, so first, okay, so I'm going to read to you, and I should have opened this up before. I had to read, I was studying for this one for 3 weeks on top of the stuff that I already knew. Man, I learned so much, and I can't even share like 1% of it with you, but I'm going to give you the summary, I'm going to give you the good parts, okay? All right, so we're going to read in Matthew 1, starting in verse 18. Now the birth of Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, happened this way. When his mother Miriam was engaged to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her publicly, made up his mind to dismiss her secretly. But while he considered these things, whoops, no, we're not going to get that. We talked about that, talking about what he would be named. So let's go down to verse 24. When Joseph woke up from his dream, he did as the angel of God commanded him and took Miriam as his wife, Mary as his wife. But he did not know her intimately until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Yeshua, Jesus. Okay, we skipped over the dream. Next week we're going to be talking about that dream and why that was in the scriptures, as well as a few other things that are in here. We're going to put them all together. So that'll be interesting. Okay, so over the last 3 weeks, I read these. I want to tell you about these. These are the Kahati Mishnah, okay, and this is not something you guys want to pick up right now and go and buy and pick up for some light reading. The Mishnah was finally all formalized in 200 AD, so less than 200 years after Yeshua, or Jesus, died. But they were already writing it before he was born, especially a lot of the stuff with the temple. These are like law codes, okay? When we have, like, when people go to court in this country, okay, we have our laws, and the law says such and such and such and such, okay? You cannot drive over 55 miles per hour on a state highway. Okay? But when they actually would get, if somebody, if they start questioning the law and say, well, you know, do you have to drive 55 miles an hour? Is that what that means? Da, 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 you know. And when they get to court, you know, when somebody gets, actually that was a really bad, but there are a whole bunch of laws, and once they get to court and they charge someone with a crime, and you say, well, the law doesn't exactly say that. So then we have to look in the precedents. Okay, so a judge will look at rulings and say, because, well, the law as it is written doesn't really cover this. And all the Torah laws aren't really, well, most of them aren't really specific. I mean, some of them are really specific, especially in Leviticus 18. But a lot of the laws in a lot of places aren't really specific, and so, you know, if this law was written and says this about what happens when you're in the country, well, what does it mean about when you're in the city? Well, and what does it mean when you're in a modern city? And the rabbis today would say, well, when you're in the modern city, this is how, you know, because times change. And although the laws don't change, the principles behind the laws, sometimes what you're going to do with them does change. Like if you say, you are allowed to scream in a movie theater. I mean, they'll kick you out if you do it, you know, too much. But like, if I see a really scary trailer, because I don't go to scary movies, and this was really funny, this happened once, and well, I was going to see a perfectly nice movie, and they had this movie called Cabin in the Woods, which I would never watch. And I'm just sitting here, and it's got this scary music, and all of a sudden a face appears in front of the window, and I scream so loud, and everybody, I kid you not, everybody in the movie theater started dying laughing. I mean, they just thought that was the funniest thing they ever heard, this short, you know, little woman thing screaming at the top of her lungs. Was that legal? Yes. What if I yelled fire? Okay. That is illegal because a stampede could start. But, you know, that's the thing. You have to take these laws that say, okay, this is okay, but then you have to say, yes, but, and what doesn't count, and does that make sense? I mean, your parents may have had rules for you when you were little that may be different now. Sometimes their rules for you when you're little aren't as harsh now. Sometimes the rules for you are harsher now than they were because you know more or because you're more responsible. Okay, the same thing, you know, we've got these explain how they kept certain laws. And I specifically read, was about half of this one called Ketubot. Well, that's not the one we're going to be talking first. And then this one was on Kiddushin and Gittin. And I'm going to tell you about these. And that was a lot of reading. And some of it made me so angry I wanted to pull out my eyeballs with a fork. Or somebody's eyeballs. But those people are dead now, so I can't do anything about how angry I was reading that stuff. That's okay, I can be a big girl. Alright, so first though, we're going to talk about betrothal. Now that was in the tractate Kiddushin, and like I said, those were written shortly after the time Yeshua or Jesus was alive, and it tells us what they were doing then. As a matter of fact, sometimes it'll tell us the differences between the laws in Galilee, where he grew up, and Judea, where he did some of his ministry, and sometimes the laws are very different. So anyway, Kiddushin is, I spelled it two different ways. Kiddushin was the ancient Hebrew word for what we call engagement, but it really couldn't be more different. So let's talk about the three different kinds of engagements. What about modern engagement? Well, you see that in TV shows. Maybe you've known someone who was engaged. Your mom and dad were engaged at one point. Now what happens is, you know, you can see in the movies, and the guy, you know, he gets a diamond ring, and he sometimes gets down on one knee and says, "Oh, Amanda, will you marry me?" And she says, "Oh, yes, I'd love to marry you. Let's live happily ever after." And, you know, then they they spend a certain amount of time planning the wedding, big bash, she gets a big white dress, and they get married. Okay, that's modern. Very informal. Nothing says you're engaged except the person's promise and the ring. Okay, what about, last year we talked about ancient engagement. I think maybe I just wrote about that in one of my books. Oh, I can't remember. Doesn't matter. Okay, ancient engagement. Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, well, Isaac and Rebekah never even met each other. Abraham sent his servant, his most trusted servant, out to go and contract an engagement with this woman that nobody had ever seen before, and he gave her a bunch of bling. I did talk about it last year because I did some calculations on how much the nose ring and the bracelets were worth. The bracelets were like $6,000 in gold. I'd be giving that guy a hard look. He wanted to get engaged to me if those were the things that he could just, send across the desert with his, camel parade. And, so that was the engagement. It was made between the father of the bride and the other father of the groom's agent in this case, but usually it's between the fathers. But an agent, and that was a lot of what this would be talking about, an agent could be like the legal spokesman for the family and go ahead and take care of this. Now, first century engagements were entirely different, but by this time, God's laws were in play, and so they had a legal system set up. It wasn't just kind of random, tradition out there in the desert. So in the first century, they had what was called kiddushin, engagement, and it was also called erusin. So you got these complicated Hebrew words that you don't even care about, right? Anyway, oh, by the way, that's correct. The one on the other page with all the I's was not correct, just in case you were wondering what my spelling mistake was, and you probably had already forgotten. I didn't sleep well last night, so a little bit loopy. Okay, so what would happen, and the thing is, in ancient times, the woman didn't really have any say. Now, they said, they contracted the marriage for Rebekah, and she didn't have any say in the matter until it came time to leave. And says, well, will you go with him now? Sure, I'll go with him now. That guy has a lot of money. Let's go, and I'll be the matriarch of a big clan because his mama's dead, and my life is moving on up. So, but in the first century, the only time that a father could arrange a betrothal without the daughter's approval was until she was 12 years old, 6 months, and 1 day old. After that, before that she was called a Nara. After that, she was called a Bojirot, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I forgot to look at how to pronounce that. I've read it a million times. After that, she has to give her approval. She can't be forcibly engaged to anyone. So, women did actually have, and the reason for that is before that, the law, they didn't expect that a girl less than 12 and a half years old really was able to make good decisions for her life and choose a husband wisely. After then, they thought, well, she's getting older, she's getting more mature, and she really needs to have a say with this person who is going to have almost absolute control over her life in a lot of ways. So, she would have a say. She would bring certain money into the marriage that was hers. She would bring certain property in the marriage that was hers, but her husband could use it and enjoy the fruits of it. But he had to pay a bride price. He actually had to pay a certain amount of money for the honor of marrying either an Israelite virgin or an Israelite divorcee or a widow. Okay? He would bring money in, she would bring money in. It was a formal engagement and had to be done legally. There was actually a contract So, I mean, and if, once the money was exchanged, that was a legal contract. It was like you made a contract, just like in modern business. And if you went back on it, you actually had to give the person you were engaged to a divorce, because you were legally bound together in marriage, even though you'd never even been alone together before. And that was one of the really interesting things that I learned, is that in Galilee, a man and a woman who were engaged were never allowed to be alone together until the actual marriage ceremony. But in Judea, they actually could be alone together. But in Judea, once they were alone together, the man was really limited. He was not able to bring her integrity into question at all. He was not allowed to say anymore that, well, when I married her, she wasn't a virgin, because he'd been alone with her, okay? He wasn't allowed to speak ill of her character. He had to marry her or give her a divorce. Either way. All right, so. Okay, so these are all engagements based on the times, and they're all different based on who had a say in what happened. Remember, whether it's just the father or the daughter, or how old the woman was. Remember, if she was over 12 and a half in one day, she could make her own decision about who she was going to marry. And where she lived. Remember, there was a difference between Judea, which was down where Jerusalem was, and Galilee. But the interesting thing is, Jerusalem law was the same as Galilee law, not Judean law, even though Jerusalem was in Judea. They had this saying that was really interesting that I read, and I wish I could remember exactly where I read it, that in Galilee, people were valued their honor more than money, but in Judea, they valued money more than their honor. That surprised me. And if you've gone through honor and shame, the Bible, you're just going, are you serious? Yeah, I'm serious, I ain't playing. All right, so, I already covered that. It had said in that one verse that before they came together, okay, now we know that coming together in this case, because they lived in the Galilee, that meant before they were ever alone together. So they had never been alone together. Mary and Joseph had never, ever once been alone together. And we don't know how old Mary was. We don't know if her father had set this up because she was less than 12 and a half, or if she had given her approval because she was older than 12 and a half. That is something we don't know. All right, so talked about that. Okay, so let's talk about marriage, which is nisu'in in the Mishnaic language. So, you know what happens in modern marriage. You have the big ceremony and you're married and it's just a one-day thing and everybody comes and they give you presents and then they leave and then you go on your honeymoon, right? Okay. Now in ancient times, before the giving of the Torah laws, we see with Isaac and Rebekah that the marriage had been contracted all the way back in Haran. The servant brought her back, and Isaac took her in to meet his father, and then he took her into Sarah's tent, which would now be Rebekah's tent, and they had marital relations, and then they were married. So there wasn't a ceremony, although I'm sure that there was a lot of feasting afterwards, because that is one thing that's common with marriages in the ancient world. A week-long feast after. All right? And we see that in the Gospel of John, where they had a week-long feast after a marriage. Oh yeah, that's a lot of feasting. Okay, first century marriage, well, like in the Gospel of John, we see it. The groom would finally come for his bride. They would have the marriage, and again, formal, totally legal. Oh, and this is interesting. This is something I didn't know. A lot of people, and I was always one of them, believed that the marriage contract was called the ketubah. But that's actually not right. The ketubah was the money in the marriage agreement that a wife was owed if her husband died and she was made a widow, or if she was divorced. He had to give her a certain amount of money. Now, if she was an Israelite virgin when she was married, and she was just a regular Israelite, that was 200 silver dinars. Okay, that's a lot of money. If she was divorced or a widow, it was 100 silver dinars. Now, if she was the daughter of a priestly family, 400 silver dinars if she was a virgin, if she'd never been married before. That's a lot of money. Now, what happens when, we'll get to that in Gittim, but what happens, that makes it really expensive to divorce because you've got to cough up that cash. Yep. All right, so, first century marriage. So that was the next thing we're going to talk about. So, divorce you can find in Tractate Gittin, not Kittin, Gittin. And a divorce document is called a get. And there's a big difference in the scripture. Sometimes you'll see something called putting away, apolion or apolise in the Greek, and sometimes you'll see divorcement. Two entirely different things. Okay, we're not going to talk about that now. We'll talk about that when we're in Matthew chapter 5 in a couple of years at the rate that I'm going. So modern divorce, it's all done in the courts, right? And sometimes man and a woman will fight, and it'll carry on for years because they're fighting about who gets this, who gets what, whatever. Ancient divorce before the Torah was pretty brutal to women. Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you were barren, after, it's between 2 and 10 years, depending on the law code. If you hadn't provided your husband with an heir, you're out of there. Yeah. And actually, with regards to that, from reading Tractate Gittin, it wasn't much better with the first century Jews either. As a matter of fact, if you turned out to be barren, God could set you free and he didn't even have to pay your ketubah money. Because he could say, hey, how was I supposed to know she didn't have any children? Like it's her fault, right? Like she went in this, I know that I can't have any children. I don't have any reason to know, but I just know it. That's why I just wanted to do violence reading this, okay? It was very, very frustrating. But yeah, in the ancient world, a man could just send his wife off. If she was barren, hopefully she could go to her father's home or her brother's home, but if not, her prospects were pretty bleak. And in the ancient world, especially if you look like at the laws of Hammurabi, and so the ancient laws, Lipit Ishtar, I think, if a woman instigated a divorce, her husband could take her to the top of a very tall tower and throw her off and crush her below. Now that's just messed up. Okay, you weren't allowed to do that in God's law. No. Now, in the first century, the way the Jews had interpreted the laws went to say that a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason. Okay? I mean, it was pretty much, he could divorce at will, and she had nothing to say about it. There were only a very few situations where a woman could divorce a man. And one of them was kind of funny. Okay, they got some of these professions that make a man really stinky. Okay, one of them was being a tanner, tanning leather hides, because I guess they used to use dog poop as a stop laughing. As a way to, okay, I'm laughing too. It's terrible, but imagine someone using dog poop to tan leather hides. I would not want to be wearing. It's kind of like, what's that smell? Oh, I'm wearing my leather bodkin. No. Dang, and there were others too, and I know that they used urine, pee, to do that too. So there were a couple of different professions where if a husband smelled bad enough, the rabbis would actually force the guy to give his wife a divorce. I guess they could understand that. But according to Hillel and the Halakha, followed Hillel until modern times, a man could divorce his wife for any reason. Now the house of Shammai Pharisees said, no, I don't think so. Torah says it has to be indecency. She has to be an adulteress. Hillel said, no, even if she ruined your meal. Have you? Okay, moms and dads, if you're out there. Have you never ruined a meal? Because dang, okay? Sometimes I leave things in the broiler too long. We got smoke in the house, and my husband could have left me about 100,000 times. Well, not that many times, but a lot of times. Oh, that's just brutal. It'd be a horrible situation for a woman to live in, having no feelings that if she tried her hardest, it would be enough. And of course, that has to be the basis for any covenant relationship, is that when we're not trying to do terrible things, that, even as we're getting older, that we're going to be good enough for our husbands or our wives. And I believe it was the prophet Malachi, or was it Micah, telling men to always be satisfied with the wife of their youth, to never want another woman. Okay, so this was important to God, and he made it clear, but Hillel wasn't paying attention in class that day. All right. So, but like I said, divorce was expensive if there was no barrenness, which meant, a woman can't have a baby. You had to pay a lot of money. If it's a priest's daughter, 400 silver dinars, if she hadn't committed adultery. Regular Israelite virgin, 200 silver dinars. Widow or divorcee, 100 silver dinars. It was expensive to get a divorce, which was why some of them were kind of going around things. Well, like I said, we'll discuss that on a later date. Now, Mary was found to be with child. And this is kind of complicated because in the Torah, it says that a woman caught in adultery, she and the man she was with would be stoned to death. Now, could they have stoned Mary? The law says no. Just finding her pregnant isn't proof of adultery. Because, she could have been raped. Things could have happened. And actually, one of the things that they have a bunch of situations in there where if a woman says she's just believed. Or if the woman says that, it was consensual, that she wasn't raped, that she was pregnant by another man, but that it was an Israelite, they still wouldn't be stoning her because they hadn't caught her in the act. The law says you had to catch her in the act. And so that was what the oral law said. Now, the first century reality was the court systems didn't like to execute anyone. And as a matter of fact, at the time that Yeshua, or Jesus, was crucified, the Jews had lost the ability to have anyone executed. They weren't allowed. They couldn't do it. Only the Romans could have somebody executed. So that's why they handed them over. That's why the Sadducean priests handed him over to the Romans, because they were powerless to do anything. But Mary was pregnant. And of course she had to go through a test called the Sotah, which declared her innocence, and we will talk about that when we talk about Luke. That's too complicated to go into today. But could they have stoned Mary? No. No, and a lot of people say, well, she could have been stoned. Well, that's actually not true. That's actually not true. They didn't have the legal right to stone her. What they could do was, and of course, what could happen was when Joseph finds her pregnant, he can say, well, I'm going to hand her a divorce. I don't want to be associated with this shamed woman or shameful woman, depending on what he thought she did. But, the angel gave him assurances, as we are going to talk about next week. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah, ancient engagement, marriage, and divorce were all very legal things. Every single phase of it required legal actions and legal contracts. And then, boy, the divorce law. You even had, everything had to be written out by scribes. You know, people couldn't just, they could, but it was frowned upon, write out their own stuff, and what they wrote out had to have the proper information or it was invalid by Jewish law. If you did not have your name and your father's name, her name and her father's name, your city of origin, her city of origin, the date, all this stuff, then it wasn't a valid document. And even if you refused to write things in it like, if I divorce her, I owe her 200 silver dinars, it didn't matter because that was just the law. You had to do it. And so it was a very legal process. Everything was done through the state. So yeah, it wasn't just this kind of thing where people got married anymore. Hadn't been like that since before the Torah was given. So that's interesting. All right, so let's have our discipleship moment. Thinking about others. You know, this is one of the hardest things about growing up. Because even grown-ups these days mostly just think of themselves because we're individuals. We think, what do I like? What do I want to do? What's important to me? Blah, 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 blah. Me, I. What's hard is to think about others and what they would like and what they would like to do and what's important to them. And especially when we're kids, we don't want to do things that we think are boring, or that we think are a waste of our time, or maybe things that other people, that'll make other people's lives easier and really make the whole family go easier. And so this week I want you to think really hard, try anyway, while you're going through your week, and somebody asks you, you want to do this? Before you say no just because you're not interested, think to yourself, is this important to the other person? Does it really hurt me to do it? If by doing this, am I going to make their life better? Am I going to make their life easier? It's one of the ways we grow in the fruit of the Spirit is by learning to esteem others more highly than ourselves. That's a Bible verse, but what does that mean in actual English? It means we're supposed to think about other people more than we think about ourselves. We're supposed to give them more honor. We're supposed to care about them as much or more than we care about ourselves. That's an important thing that Yeshua came to teach us. And everything he did was for other people. He could have gone around bragging all the time. He could have gone around collecting the money. Instead he had people supporting him out of their means as he would go around and taking care of his needs, but he was never rich because he was doing for others. Okay? Anyway, so that's it for this week. And like I told, next week we are going to talk about birth stories and how the great men in the ancient world would have these fantastic stories surrounding their birth and how it gave them honor in the eyes of the reader. We're going to talk about Alexander the Great. We're going to talk about Julius Caesar. We're going to talk about Cyrus the Great. So it's going to be really interesting. I hope so. I think it's interesting. Think about me and you say, oh yeah, that's really interesting, Miss Tyler, because it'll mean a lot to me. All right. So anyway, I love you, I'm praying for you, and I hope you had a wonderful week studying the scripture together as a family. Oh, and hello to my very special friend, Josiah. And he knows who he is. I love you guys. Bye.